Growing up, I was always a Nintendo kid. From Game Boy to Game Boy Advance to GameCube, I was pretty much exclusively playing Nintendo games, and one series I played a lot of on each of these systems was The Legend of Zelda. Starting with the Oracle of Ages, to Minish Cap on Game Boy Advance, to Master's Quest Ocarina of Time on GameCube, I absolutely loved The Legend of Zelda, and that really hasn't changed all these years later. I played through pretty much every title in the series at this point, and I can't help myself from going back and re-experiencing them from time to time. This has been something I've loved about Nintendo Switch Online, a chance to go back and play games I loved in the past, looking better than ever on the Switch. Back in June of this year, Nintendo announced a few new games coming to the SEGA Genesis app on Nintendo Switch Online. And like I mentioned, I was always a Nintendo kid. So whenever Genesis games are added to the online service, unless it's a Sonic game, there's a good chance I've never played them, and even likely I've never even heard of the games. This is the exact scenario I was in when I saw Crusader of Centy was added to the list of playable games. I didn't even bat an eye. I had no idea what that game was. But just a few hours later, I saw tons of people excited this game was coming to the service, and come to find out, some people were even calling Crusader of Centy Sega's Legend of Zelda. I decided I needed to see it for myself what I was missing all this time, and while I do think this game clearly takes some inspiration from the Zelda series, and I will acknowledge that as needed, I would be doing it a disservice to talk about it as only a Zelda clone. Crusader of Centy stands on its own. The game opens up with a pretty long intro with story exposition talking about the monsters and how they've come back to the world, giving a pretty clear indication that this is going to be your problem, as an otherwise normal child who was just given a sword for the first time, to go and fix. The game makes a great first impression with its lovely pixel art style and music that is constantly outdoing itself as more tracks are introduced. Some genuinely great bops here. Look, even Sonic the Hedgehog himself wants to chill out and listen. A staple of the Zelda series is the equipment you find along your journey that is used to solve different puzzles, traverse different obstacles, fight certain enemies, etc., etc. Getting a cool item in a Zelda dungeon always feels great and can change the way you interact with your surroundings, and can even allow you to go back to previous area to find new things. In Crusader of Centy, there's a very similar system, but it's covered by befriending different animal companions. For the most part, you the player just have a sword that you can swing and throw while you run around and jump, but most of the interesting skills you obtain are actually performed by equipping these animal friends and getting them to run alongside you. At the end of the day, it's really no different in function than equipping a different item to Link in a Zelda game, but I think the animal friends are a nice touch and make the game feel a little less lonely as you gather more and more to help you along the way. A really cool feature here is depending on the combination of the animals you have on, they can combine for unique added effects. One that comes to mind is the pretty funny combination of fire and ice abilities, granting you an even stronger ice attack for some reason, because who needs fire? I also want to point out that there's a cat companion you can get early on that acts as an auto revive if you die, and that is probably a, cat 9 lives sort of thing, but I just wanted to stress that if I died, both of my cats would not hesitate to eat me. No chance they're bringing me back. At one point in the game, you get a cheetah friend, and having it on just lets you run really fast. Shocking, I know. But I never wanted to take this off. It almost made the game unplayable for me in situations where I had to take it off in favor of other animals for puzzles, because I just felt so slow. Running around with the cheetah and jumping super far made the movement in this game tons of fun, and I felt like a dang Olympian running circles around all the enemies and jumping around like a madman avoiding attacks. If you can imagine what the Rock's cape feels like in some of the top-down Zelda games, just imagine using that but running twice as fast constantly, and you'll understand how fun this is. Jumping in general is just fun in this game. You don't start with it immediately, but you should get it in the first 30 minutes to hour of playing, and the platforming in this game was a good touch to help it stand out. There is a dedicated jump button, no having to equip a jumping animal or anything, and even simple little jumps help break up the monotony of running through the overworld, and as the game gets going, you can run faster and jump farther, and the platforming naturally becomes more challenging, but it never felt like it was in the way or a pain. Throughout the game, going from area to area, dungeon to dungeon, you'll have a variety of puzzles and obstacles you'll need to overcome. Pretty standard stuff for a game like this, but I actually think this is one of the weaker parts of the game. Sometimes, you'll need to hit a switch by throwing your sword from a certain spot, bouncing it off of walls, or guiding it around a corner. Stuff like that's pretty fun and can make for a satisfying solution. But more often than not, puzzles boil down to doing something as simple as hitting a red box that explodes and reveals a path forward, which is not super exciting. And then there are the especially egregious ones, the hit a random wall with your sword, or jump at a random spot on the ground kind of thing. There were times where the context of what you're doing in the dungeon or story could help, or maybe an NPC hinted at something for you to do, but that wasn't always the case. and maybe I missed these clues sometimes, but on more than one occasion, I found myself stumped on how to progress for it to be something silly that I would never think to actually go and do. I did resort to using a guide in moments such as these, no shame in that, which did kind of grease the wheels a bit to make these moments not quite as frustrating as they otherwise would be. I do recommend using a guide here if you get stuck. This game tends to not be as straightforward as a Zelda game on where to be going next and what to be doing next. Sometimes you just have to wander around a bit until you find the right path. There are dungeons in this game, but I would advise you not to think of them like a Zelda dungeon. You aren't finding keys to go from room to room, and they're not nearly as long or intimately crafted as what you find in a Zelda game. Think of these as more of themed areas where the puzzles and platforming are just a little bit more prevalent. It's not always super obvious when you even are in a dungeon. I don't even really remember if they're referred to as dungeons in the first place, but you can kind of see what they were going for. Overall, there were a couple memorable ones, but nothing you would expect to find in a top 10 video. Each ends with a boss, and in contrast to the dungeons themselves, these were a highlight for me. Bosses all looked great and were unique monsters not seen in the lead up to the fight itself. They would all give you their cheesy boss opening monologue to start, and then they would give you a health upgrade upon defeat, which always made me feel good when I took one down. The bosses didn't just look the part visually, they also brought in fun mechanics that kept them interesting and not feeling repetitive. Some had you utilizing platforming, some had you hit them with specific attacks you just unlocked, a lot of them had you throwing your sword to get damage. The first part to any boss fight is trying to figure out how to hurt it, and that never felt like a chore here. You always kind of knew what you were going to have to do, but it still felt satisfying to pull it off when you did it. One of my favorites sent out duplicates of itself, and you had to keep your eyes on the real boss as it weaved in and out of its clones. The bosses were never too terribly difficult, and you were almost always given health prior to the fight, so never really got frustrated with the boss's fights like I would trying to get to them from time to time. I enjoyed my time with Crusader of Centy, and I'm thankful this game was brought to my attention and added to Switch Online where I could easily access it. It is sadly only available on the expansion pack of Switch Online, but at least it's there to play. This game was a pretty late release in the Genesis, coming out right before the release of the SEGA Saturn, so it's actually pretty tough to get your hands on a physical copy unless you want to pay an arm and a leg for it. Other than that, I think it was released on one of the SEGA mini consoles, but overall not super easy to find and play. The game has its problems, as any game does, but using a companion guide can really help keep the experience enjoyable. It's legitimately a really fun time once you get a few of the abilities and can start running around, killing monsters and fighting the great bosses. Crusader of Centy is not a very long game, taking me about 5 or 6 hours to finish, so if you're interested, it won't be much of a time commitment to squeeze into your busy gaming schedule that everyone has. I had fun with it, you might too, give it a go. Thanks for watching. If you managed to stick with me all the way to the end and enjoyed the video, throwing a like on the video would help a lot. If you want to see more videos, I try to post at least once a week in addition to streaming when I can, so if you want to subscribe and keep up with what's next, that'd be much appreciated as well. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.